The morning Hugh Atkins rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1879, he had exactly 43 cents in his coat pocket, a horse that was limping on her left foreleg, and a hunger in his belly that had been sitting there so long it had started to feel like company. He came down the main road slow, the way a man rides when he has nowhere urgent to be and nothing waiting for him at the other end. The town of Caldwell sat at the edge of the Cherokee Strip, a cattle town that smelled like trail dust and ambition, where drovers and merchants and gamblers all mingled together under a sky so wide and blue it made a man feel both enormous and entirely insignificant at the same time. Hugh had been through a dozen towns like this one. He knew the rhythm of them. He knew which saloons would let a broke man sit in the corner undisturbed, and which ones would have him thrown out before he could get his boots fully under the table. He knew which livery stables had soft-hearted owners who would look away when a man bedded down beside his horse without paying. He had learned all these things the hard way, the way most cowboys learned anything worth knowing. He was 31 years old, lean in the way that comes not from good living, but from too many skipped meals and too many hard miles. His jaw carried a week's worth of dark beard, his brown hat was shaped by weather rather than intention, and his eyes were the kind of gray-blue that looked almost silver when the light hit them sideways. He had ridden trail crews from Texas to Colorado for the better part of 8 years, working for outfits large and small, and somewhere along the way the years had piled up behind him like old fence posts without ever amounting to anything he could point to and call his. No land. No savings to speak of. No family waiting anywhere under any particular roof. He tied his mare, Rosie, to the post outside the general store and went inside to spend 15 of his 43 cents on a tin of crackers and a small block of hard cheese, which he ate standing at the counter with a dignity he'd had to practice keeping. The storekeeper, a round man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, watched him without judgment. In Caldwell, men came through all the time looking like Hugh Atkins looked. It was part of the landscape. "You looking for work?" The storekeeper asked, not unkindly. "Always," Hugh said, brushing cracker crumbs from his coat front. "There's a widow woman out on the Kishom side about 4 miles east, the Turner place. Her husband passed last October. She's been running that spread alone since. Her and a couple of hired hands who both quit come March. Heard she's been asking around." Hugh folded the remaining cheese into his pocket carefully. "What kind of spread?" "Cattle, mostly. Maybe 80 head, some horses. Good pasture land. Her husband, James Turner, built it up nice before he took sick. Pneumonia got him before Christmas." The storekeeper shook his head in the way that people do when they're genuinely sorry about something. "She's a good woman. Capable. But 80 head of cattle and a ranch that needs maintaining is a lot for one person to manage alone, especially heading into summer." Hugh thanked the man and walked back outside. He stood in the sunlight for a moment, turning the information over in his mind. He had no particular plans that pointed him elsewhere. Rosie needed rest and food she wasn't getting. He needed work. There were worse things than riding 4 miles east to ask. He found the Turner ranch easily enough by following the storekeeper's directions and the line of good fence posts that stretched along the property's eastern edge. The fence was well built, which told him something about the man who had put it there. James Turner had cared about his land. The posts were straight, the wire tight, the corners properly braced. A man who builds good fence is a man who thinks about the future, and a man who thinks about the future generally builds everything else with the same care. The house itself sat back from the road maybe 200 yards, a sturdy 2-story structure built of timber and stone, with a wide porch running across the front. There was a proper barn behind it, red-painted, and a small bunkhouse off to the side. Several horses grazed in a near pasture, and he could see cattle moving on the far rise. The yard was kept up. Someone was working here, even without hired hands. He rode up to the gate at a respectful pace, dismounted before opening it because that was good manners, led Rosie through and remounted. As he came up the path toward the house, a woman came out onto the porch. She had heard him coming, which meant she was paying attention. That was another thing that told him something. Clara Turner was 28 years old and had not yet settled into the grief that sometimes turned widows into smaller, more cautious versions of themselves. She stood at the porch railing straight-backed, with a practical linen dress, the color of wheat, and dark hair pinned up in a way that had probably started the morning neat, but was now coming loose in strands around her face from whatever she had been doing before he arrived. She had brown eyes, clear and direct, and the kind of face that would have been called handsome rather than pretty in most of the parlors between here and St. Louis, which was not a diminishment at all because handsome lasts longer and cuts deeper. She had flour on her left forearm and a rifle leaning against the doorframe behind her, within easy reach but not in her hands, which he took as the correct degree of caution for a woman alone on a frontier ranch receiving an unknown visitor. "Afternoon," Hugh said, pulling Rosie up at the base of the porch steps. He took his hat off. "My name is Hugh Atkins. I was in town and heard you might be looking for help. I'm a cowhand. I've worked cattle drives, ranch work, fence work, horse handling. I've been at it 8 years. I can show myself useful if you'll give me the chance." Clara looked at him the way people look at things they're trying to assess quickly and accurately. She looked at his horse first, which he appreciated. A person who checks the horse before the rider is usually someone whose judgment can be trusted. "Your mare's favoring her left foreleg," she said. "Yes, ma'am. Stone bruise. I think she needs rest and some dry ground." "How long have you been riding her like that?" "About a day and a half," he admitted. "I didn't have many options." Clara's eyes came back to him. She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the yard and stirred the loose strands of hair against her cheek, and she didn't bother to tuck them back. "I can offer room and board and a wage at the end of the season," she said carefully. "I should be honest with you. The season runs through the fall roundup. That's roughly 6 months. After that I may not be able to keep a full hand on through winter. I don't have money to spend on promises I can't keep." "I appreciate the honesty," Hugh said. "What are your terms?" she asked. He thought about the 43 cents, now 36. He thought about Rosie's leg and his own empty belly and the long, empty road behind him. Then he said something he hadn't entirely planned on saying. "I don't have a price right now. Let me work the season and we'll settle up at the end when we both know what it's been worth." She stared at him for a moment. "That's an unusual arrangement." "It suits me," he said simply. Another pause. The cattle lowed somewhere on the far rise. Rosie shifted her weight off her sore leg and Hugh put a hand on her neck to steady her. "There's a stall in the barn for your horse," Clara said finally. "Put her up, check the water trough, then come to the back door and I'll feed you." That was yes. He put his hat back on. "Yes, ma'am, thank you." He led Rosie to the barn and took his time with her, pulling the stone bruise proper and packing it with clean mud from the water trough's edge, and wrapping it in a strip of cloth he kept in his saddlebag for exactly this purpose. He made sure she had grain and good water. He checked on the other horses briefly, just to see what kind of animals she was keeping. They were in good condition, well fed, with clean stalls. Someone had been doing the work. When he came around to the back of the house, Clara had a plate of cold beef and boiled potatoes sitting on the kitchen step and a cup of coffee beside it. She herself was back inside. He sat on the step and ate like a man who had been hungry for a long time but still remembered how to eat with some measure of decorum, and the coffee was the best thing he had tasted in weeks. That was the first day. The second day he was up before dawn. He found the list of tasks Clara had left on the barn door, written in a neat, firm hand. Check the south fence line, move the cattle from the near pasture to the western grass, pull the wagon wheel that had cracked and put on the spare, and assess the condition of the roof on the bunkhouse before he moved into it. He worked until the light was gone. He pulled the cracked wheel and fitted the spare, having to do it mostly by himself with a lever and 2 large stones used as blockers, which took longer than it would have with a second pair of hands but was done properly in the end. He moved the cattle, which required getting to know their individual temperaments quickly, and which ones were the troublemakers who would test a new hand. He identified 3 of them, a big brindle steer and 2 heifer yearlings who had too much spirit and not enough sense. He noted the south fence had 2 sections that needed serious attention, not just patching, and he noted this in a careful list of his own. He checked the bunkhouse roof and found 2 soft spots that would leak badly in heavy rain and needed new timber and shingle work. When he came to the supper table that evening, Clara had a proper meal waiting, salt pork and cornbread and canned peaches that were a luxury he would not have expected. She sat across the table from him and they ate together because there was no one else to eat with and it would have been odd to do otherwise. "The south fence needs 2 full sections replaced," he said, when the initial business of eating had settled into something more conversational. "Not patched, replaced. The posts have rotted at the base. You could patch them through summer, but they won't hold a hard push in the fall when the cattle are heavier." Clara nodded. She was not surprised. "My husband ordered the timber before he got sick. It came in November. It's in the barn, still wrapped. Then I'll get to it after the immediate work. The bunkhouse roof, 2 soft spots. I can fix those in a day if the weather holds." She cut a piece of cornbread in half and set 1 piece on his plate before he could object, because his portion had been smaller than hers and she had noticed. He looked at it and then at her, and she was already looking at her plate, so he ate the cornbread and said nothing except "thank you," which she acknowledged with a slight nod. "You said you've worked drives," she said. "Which outfits?" "Good night-loving trail, 3 years. Couple seasons with a smaller outfit out of Abilene, name of Prentice, they're gone now. A year with the Shanghai Pierce crew, which was an education in itself." That made her smile slightly, because anyone who knew anything about the cattle business in Texas knew that Shanghai Pierce was one of the loudest, most colorful figures to ever sit a saddle. "My husband worked a summer for Pierce," she said. "He came back with more stories than sense," he said. It was the first time she had mentioned her husband in anything other than factual terms, and he heard the weight of it in her voice, the way it sat there with affection and grief folded together the way those 2 things do when someone has been genuinely loved and genuinely lost. "He sounds like a man who built well," Hugh said carefully. "This place is put together right." Clara looked at him. "He was, yes." The days found their rhythm quickly. Hugh was a man who worked without needing direction once he understood what a place needed, and a ranch speaks its own language if you know how to listen to it. He listened. He repaired the bunkhouse roof in 1 long day, working from first light until he could barely see the nails, and when the rain came 3 days later it came hard and the bunkhouse was dry as a church on Monday morning. The south fence took 4 days of hard labor and left his hands raw at the end of it, but when he was done, those sections would hold through a decade of hard winters. He built them the same way James Turner had built the original fence, straight and strong, and with an eye toward the future. Clara watched all of this from the corners of her days, in the way that someone who has learned not to trust easily watches things they are beginning to trust. She brought him water in the afternoon heat without being asked. She left his supper on the stove on the 2 evenings. She retired early with a headache that he suspected was grief wearing the costume of a headache, which is something grief does. She kept the accounts of the ranch in a leather-bound ledger that she sometimes worked on at the kitchen table in the evenings, while he sat at the other end cleaning his saddle or mending gear. And they talked sometimes and were quiet sometimes, and both of those things felt natural in a way that surprised them both. One evening, about 3 weeks in, she came out to the barn while he was working on Rosie's leg, which was mending well but needed continued attention. She stood in the barn doorway with the evening light behind her, holding 2 cups of coffee, and he looked up from where he was crouched beside the mare. "How is she?" Clara asked, stepping inside and handing him a cup. "Better every day. She's putting weight on it properly now. Another 2 weeks and she'll be right." Clara stroked Rosie's nose with a familiar ease that told him she was comfortable with horses. The mare turned her head and accepted it with a kind of heavy-lidded equine satisfaction. "She's pretty," Clara said. "She's tough," Hugh replied, "which I appreciate more than pretty generally." Clara glanced at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read, and then she looked back at the horse. "Where did you get her?" "Won her in a card game in Wichita 4 years ago," he said. "I was the worst card player at the table by a considerable margin. The man who owned her had already cleaned out everyone else and he was bored, I think. So he offered the horse against everything I had, which was about $12. I didn't especially expect to win." "But you did." "I did. She was 2 years old and half wild, and it took me a week to get her to let me touch her without trying to take my hand off." He rubbed the mare's neck and she leaned into it. "We came to an understanding eventually," Clara smiled. It was the first time he had seen her smile fully and without reservation, and it changed her face in a way that was not subtle. It made him look at his coffee cup. June came in with heat that pressed down on the Kansas plains like a flat iron. The cattle needed moving to the creek pasture where there was shade and running water, which required 2 days of careful driving. And on the first day, Clara rode with him because she knew her cattle better than he did and could anticipate the trouble spots. She rode well, practically and confidently, on a steady bay gelding she called Sherman, and watching her work a stubborn cow and calf pair back toward the main group with efficient patience, Hugh felt the particular quiet admiration of one skilled person watching another skilled person do what they do well. "You've done this before," he said, when they stopped at midday near a stand of cottonwoods to water the horses. "My whole life," she said. "I grew up on a ranch in Texas, near Fredericksburg. My father ran cattle." "Then you didn't need me to explain what a stone bruise was." She looked at him sidelong. "No, I knew what it was. Why'd you ask about it then?" She tied Sherman's reins to a low branch and reached into her saddlebag for the biscuits she had wrapped in cloth that morning. She handed him 2 without asking and kept 2 for herself. "I wanted to see if you'd be honest about how long you'd been riding her hurt," she said. "A man who lies about small things generally lies about large ones too." He understood then that his answer on the porch that first day, a day and a half, had mattered more than he had realized. "And I passed?" he asked. "You're still here," she said, which was not quite the same as an answer but was close enough to be satisfying. July brought its own challenges. 3 of the cows calved, one of them at an inconvenient angle that required Hugh to spend most of a night in the barn working with a difficult delivery. And Clara was there beside him for all of it, sleeves rolled up, completely unafraid of the messiness of the process. When the calf finally came, damp and blinking and indignant, and the cow turned to smell it with that particular deep maternal certainty, Clara sat back on her heels in the straw and laughed with pure relief, and Hugh sat back on his heels too and looked at her laughing and felt something move in his chest that was new and inconvenient and honest. He didn't say anything about it. He cleaned up and went back to the bunkhouse and lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling and told himself firmly that it was gratitude he was feeling and admiration and the natural warmth of shared work. He told himself this with considerable firmness, and it worked for about 4 days. What made it stop working was a Thursday afternoon when a man rode up from town. He was well dressed, thick through the chest, with a silver watch chain and the kind of smile that is practiced in mirrors. His name was Garrett Rowlands, and he was the owner of the Rowlands Land and Cattle Company, which had been buying up smaller spreads in the county for the past 2 years. Hugh was repairing the near paddock gate when the man arrived, and he watched from a respectful distance as Rowlands dismounted with the ease of a man who considers himself welcome everywhere and took Clara's hand, and held it slightly longer than a greeting required. Hugh didn't hear what was said, but he watched Clara's face, which was polite and contained, and told him nothing except that she was being very careful about what she let show. Rowlands talked for perhaps 20 minutes, gestured at the land several times with a wide proprietary sweep that made Hugh's jaw tighten without quite knowing why, and then rode away with the same practiced ease. Clara stood in the yard watching him go, and then she turned and looked at Hugh with an expression that was tired in a specific way. That evening at supper she explained without being asked. Rowlands had been offering to buy the Turner land since shortly after James died. He had come back twice in the winter. Now he was coming again. His offers were fair by the letter of them, but she did not want to sell. This was James's land, built by James's hands and her own beside his, and her son was buried in the small cemetery plot at the back of the property, near the oak tree where she and James had eaten their first picnic on this land 5 years ago, when James was still alive and full of plans. Hugh had not known about the child. He kept his face still when she mentioned it, because grief this particular requires witness without intrusion. He was 2 years old, Clara said, in the level voice people use when they've had to tell a hard thing many times and have worn a smooth path through the telling of it. His name was Samuel. He passed 2 summers before James did. Fever. I'm sorry, Hugh said. It was inadequate and true. I've thought about selling, she admitted. Sometimes it seems like the sensible thing. This land holds a lot of grief, but it also holds everything James and I built together, and Samuel knew this yard, these trees. There are times when I cannot imagine leaving and times when I cannot imagine staying, and most of the time I'm just working too hard to think about either option clearly. She looked at him across the table. Her coffee cup was in both hands. There was something tentative and brave in the way she was saying all of this out loud, like someone testing ice before putting their full weight on it. I don't think you should sell, Hugh said. This land is worth keeping. Because it's valuable property, she asked, with a slight edge to the question that told him she was testing something. Because it's yours, he said, and because James Turner built it to last and it has, and because you don't actually want to sell it, you've already decided that. You're just looking for someone to agree with you. She was quiet for a moment. That's uncomfortably accurate, she said. I can be quiet about it if you prefer. No, she set her cup down. No, I don't prefer that. It's the most honest thing anyone has said to me in several months. After that, something shifted between them. Some careful wall that had been built from mutual politeness and recent grief and the practical distance of employer and employee. It didn't come down all at once. It came down the way spring ice comes off a river, slowly and then suddenly, with a sound somewhere in between cracking and sighing. It showed in small things first. She started coming out to the barn in the evenings more regularly, with 2 cups of coffee and staying longer. They talked about his childhood in Missouri, about her years in Fredericksburg, about the cattle business and the way it was changing as the railheads moved, and the big operations squeezed the small ones harder every year. She had opinions about everything and they were well considered, and she stated them without apology. He liked this about her more than he could have predicted. He had met plenty of women who kept their opinions tucked away like good tablecloths, brought out only for special occasions. Clara's mind was an everyday use item, clear and direct and not inclined toward decoration. One evening she brought out a photograph. It was in a small oval frame, the kind taken at a proper studio, and it showed a man with a broad face and an honest expression, his arm around a younger Clara who was looking at the camera with the slight self-consciousness people had about being photographed in those days. James Turner had looked like his fence posts, Hugh thought, solid and square and built to last. He would have liked you, Clara said, studying the photograph. He had a good eye for people who worked without needing to be watched. That's a fine thing to say about someone. He would have wanted me to find someone, she added, and then she said it quickly and looked at the window, and the silence that followed was dense with things neither of them addressed that evening. But they sat there with it between them, the way you sit with something you're not ready to pick up yet but don't want to set down either. August came with its full weight of heat and work. The cattle were fat and restless, and the flies were a misery to every living creature on the property. There was a section of creek bank that had collapsed and needed shoring up before it washed out further and took good pasture land with it. Hugh spent 3 days on the creek project, working in water up to his knees, and Clara brought food out to him at midday and sometimes stayed to hand him things, passing boards and long stones with her skirt pinned up out of the water, her boots left on the bank. She had slim, strong ankles, and she was perfectly comfortable wading in a creek and handing lumber to a man. And it did not occur to her to comment on any of this as unusual, because it was not unusual to her. On the third day of the creek project, they worked side by side in companionable silence for a long stretch. And at some point, he noticed that the silence between them was the particular kind that is an intimacy rather than an absence. The kind where two people have gotten comfortable enough to exist in the same space without filling it with words. And the recognition of this landed somewhere central in him like a stone dropping into still water. He handed her a board to hold while he nailed it into place, and their hands overlapped on the wood for a moment, hers over his, and neither of them pulled back immediately. He looked at her. She was looking at the creek. Then she looked at him, and the expression on her face was something he did not have a name for immediately, only that it was complicated and soft and not afraid. He did not say anything right then. He nailed the board in place, and she held it steady, and the creek ran past them, and the cottonwood leaves turned silver and back in the afternoon wind. That evening, Rollins came back. This time he did not stop at the polite formalities. Hugh was carrying water to the barn when he heard the conversation from the yard, and Roland's voice was pitched in the particular way that men pitch their voices when they believe they are the most important person present, which is a carrying and unpleasant voice. "Clara, I've given you a fair offer and I've given it multiple times," Rollins was saying. "I'm raising it now, substantially. You have a working man on your land and some cattle and a house, but you have no partner and no future here as a woman alone. This is not practicable as a long-term arrangement. Let me take this land and let me set you up properly somewhere else. I can see to it that you're comfortable." Hugh kept his hands on the water bucket and kept walking toward the barn. "I've told you my position on this, Garrett," Clara said, and her voice was patient steel. "The answer has not changed. You're being sentimental." "I'm being decided," she said, "which is different. I'd like you to ride out now." There was a moment of heavy silence, and then the sound of Roland's mounting and the particular hard rhythm of a horse being pushed away from a property by a man with wounded pride. Hugh finished watering the horses and came back out to find Clara standing in the yard with her arms crossed and her jaw set, looking after the retreating rider. Stood beside her and said nothing because she didn't need words right then. After a moment she said, "He's going to keep coming." "Probably," Hugh agreed. "He seems to believe that wearing someone down is the same as convincing them. Men like that often think that." She turned to look at him. The evening sun was behind him and it made his face harder to read, which perhaps made it easier for her to say what she said next. "I'm not going to sell this land, Hugh. I want to be clear about that. I've been thinking about it carefully since Rollins first started coming by, and I've thought about it clearly now, and the answer is no. I'm going to keep this place and build it up the way James intended. I'm going to buy more cattle in the spring and expand the north pasture, and I'm going to do this because it's what he started, and it's what I want to finish." "All right," he said. "All right," she echoed. There was something resolved in her face that had not been there before, like a woman who has been carrying a question for a long time and has finally set it down and picked up the answer instead. September arrived, and with it, the advance business of fall roundup, which was the work Hugh had been brought on to lead. Clara had 10 head she was planning to drive to the Caldwell stockyards for sale, carefully selected by her and refined by Hugh's advice over the preceding weeks. They were in good shape. The market was decent. Clara had worked the numbers in her ledger 3 ways, and they came up satisfactory on all 3, which meant the ranch would be solvent for another year and have capital to invest in the spring. The night before the roundup drive, Hugh found himself sleepless in the bunkhouse. He lay on his bunk in the dark and thought about the season ending and what came after. Clara had said at the start that she might not keep a hand through winter. He had not needed to think about this very much for most of the summer because there had always been more work than days to do it, and summer is good at pushing other concerns out of the frame. But now September was cooling the nights, and he found himself thinking about the 43 cents he'd arrived with, and the way things had shifted between them over 6 months into something that was honest and warm and growing towards something he did not have the words for yet, or rather had the words but was not ready to say them. He thought about what it would mean to leave. He thought about this with the clarity that comes from lying in the dark when there is nothing else to occupy your mind, and the clarity was not complicated. He did not want to leave. Not the work, not the land, and not Clara Turner, who was more fully herself than anyone he had met in 31 years of living, who brought coffee to a barn in the evenings and waded in a creek without complaint, and told Garrett Rowland's no with the quiet finality of a door being shut on a conversation that did not deserve to continue. He thought about the price he had never named. He had said he'd settle at the end. The end was coming. He thought about what it meant that he hadn't named a price, and he thought about it for a long time before he understood that what it had meant, from the first moment on the porch, was that he hadn't wanted to leave with money. He had wanted something else entirely, even if he couldn't have said so on that first day, not because he hadn't known it somewhere deep and instinctive, but because wanting it had felt too large to look at directly. He got up before dawn and built the coffee and brought 2 cups out to the porch and sat in the dark waiting for her light to come on, which it did at the usual time, and he heard her moving in the kitchen, and after a few minutes she opened the door to find him sitting on the porch with a cup ready for her. She took it without comment and sat in the other chair. The sky was beginning to come apart at the eastern edge, the darkness going thin and then blue and then the faintest pink. "Roundup day," she said. "Roundup day," he agreed. They drank their coffee. The horses were restless in the barn, sensing the day's intention. In the distance, a coyote called once and then was quiet. "I need to tell you something," Hugh said. Clara turned to look at him. Her face in the gray pre-dawn light was composed and attentive, and there was something in her eyes that told him she had been waiting for this conversation without knowing exactly what it would contain. "I said at the start that I'd name my price at the end of the season," he said. "The end of the season is coming up." "Yes," she said. "I've been thinking about what I want." He held the coffee cup in both hands and looked at the lightening horizon. "I've been thinking about it hard and honest. And what I want isn't money, Clara. I should be clear about that. You owe me wages for 6 months of work, and I'll take them if you're offering them, and I'll put them towards something useful. But that's not the price I meant when I said I'd name it later." The silence between them was the held breath kind. "What I want," he said, "is to stay, not just through winter. I want to stay on this land. I want to keep building what you and James started. I want to be here." He looked at her now. "I want to be here with you, if that's something you'd consider." Clara was still. The horizon was growing pink in earnest now, and a meadowlark started somewhere across the pasture. Her hands were wrapped around her cup, and she was looking at him with an expression that he couldn't entirely read, only that it was not closed and it was not unmoved. "I'm not a simple proposition," she said finally, with a quietness that was not a warning so much as an honest statement of fact. "I'm a widow with a ranch and a grief that still has roots in me, and a stubbornness that my mother always said would either serve me well or get me killed. None of those things discourage me," he said. "Not one of them. You've known me 6 months," she said. "I know what 6 months of working beside someone tells you. I know what it tells me about you." She was quiet for another moment. Then she said softly, "I've been trying to talk myself out of this since July. And I haven't managed it," she admitted. "Every time I nearly succeeded, you do something like fix the creek bank or pull a difficult calf and I'd have to start over. Despite everything," he laughed. It was a quiet, early morning laugh that the meadowlark seemed to answer. "I can try to be less useful," he offered. "Don't," she said, and the word was simple and held more in it than its single syllable deserved. She reached over and put her hand on his, there on the arm of the porch chair, and he turned his hand over so her hand was in his, which is a small and enormous thing all at once. They sat like that watching the sun come up over the Kansas plain, gold and wide and absolute, and the day opened around them with all the particular grace of a thing that has been growing toward this moment for a long time. They drove the cattle to Caldwell that day, both of them, and it went well. The 10 heads sold at a good price, and the buyer, a rancher named McCready from south of the county, complimented the condition of the animals in a way that Clara received with dignity and Hugh received with the quiet satisfaction of a craftsman hearing his work praised. On the road home, riding side by side in the cool of the September afternoon, they talked differently than they had before, with the ease and warmth of people who have stopped calculating the distance between themselves. "My mother will want to meet you," Clara said, in a tone that was matter-of-fact and slightly amused. "Where's your mother?" "Fredericksburg still. She runs the household for my brother and his wife. She will have opinions about the entire situation." "What kinds of opinions?" "Most of them will involve the phrase, 'not before the proper time,'" Clara said. "My mother is a woman of principle and also of considerable patience when principle demands it. She will want us to behave correctly." "I intend to behave correctly," Hugh said. "Yes," Clara said, with a look that told him she believed him and also found the whole subject quietly entertaining. "I know you do." He proposed properly in October, by which time Clara's mother, a formidable woman named Eleanor who had driven up from Fredericksburg in her brother's wagon with very little advance notice and a lot of expressed opinions, had spent 2 weeks at the Turner ranch watching Hugh Atkins work, watching the way he spoke to her daughter, watching the way her daughter looked at him when she thought no one was observing, and had arrived at conclusions that she stated plainly on the morning of her 3rd day. "He's solid," Eleanor told Clara over the breakfast table while Hugh was in the barn. "He's the right kind of solid. Your father was that kind of solid. James was that kind of solid. It's rare and it counts for more than charm." "Mother," Clara said, in the tone that daughters use when their mothers are accurate. "I'm not pressuring you," Eleanor said. "I'm observing. There's a difference, as I've told you since you were 7 years old." Hugh proposed on a Tuesday evening on the porch without any particular theatrical preparation. He had thought about doing it with more ceremony, but he was not a man of ceremony, and Clara was not a woman who would have valued it more than the honest thing behind it. He asked her to marry him with a straight look and a steady voice, and she said yes with the same directness with which she approached everything worth doing. Eleanor, who was inside the house, heard the quiet that followed and smiled at her knitting. They were married at the end of October, 1879, in Caldwell's small church, by a minister who had a gentle manner and a fine speaking voice. Clara wore a dress she had brought out from a trunk in the bedroom, a cream-colored wool dress that had been made for her first wedding and fit her still, which she had chosen not from sentiment or irony, but because it was the finest dress she owned and it was warm for the season. Hugh wore his best shirt, which was clean and pressed, and a coat borrowed from Eleanor's son-in-law, who was roughly his size. The town came out in the way that frontier towns do for their own people's celebrations, because in a place where life is often hard and loss is regular, the making of a new family is a genuine communal joy. The storekeeper who had told Hugh about the widow Turner came and shook his hand with real warmth. McCready, the cattle buyer, came and gave them a bottle of good whiskey. Several of the neighboring ranchers came with their wives and children, and there was a fiddle player from somewhere near the stockyards who played until late in the evening in the churchyard, where tables had been set up. Hugh danced with Clara twice in the churchyard, which was twice more than he had danced in the preceding several years, and she danced well and made him look better at it than he was. "You're a passable dancer," she told him during the second dance. "I'm a terrible dancer," he said. "You're making me look better." "I am," she agreed without false modesty, and he spun her and she laughed, and Eleanor watched from her chair at the edge of the yard with her cup of cider and a softness on her face that was hard-earned joy. The first winter of their marriage was the kind that tests people and finds them equal to it. The Kansas plains in winter are not gentle. The cold came in January with particular seriousness. 3 days of temperatures that drove everything that could go inside, and made everything that couldn't suffer the elements do so with grim determination. Hugh and Clara worked the cold season side by side, carrying feed to the cattle through wind that made conversation impossible and cold that made hands clumsy and necessary work harder than it ought to have been. They learned each other in the winter, the way you learn things that are important rather than merely interesting. They learned each other's patience and impatience, their silences and their noises, the way Hugh woke before dawn regardless of the temperature and always made the coffee before Clara was up, and the way Clara was the one who sat with the account books in the evening and could carry numbers in her head through an entire complex calculation while holding a conversation about something entirely different. They learned that Hugh had a temper that he kept on a short and well-managed leash, and that, when it occasionally slipped, it expressed itself in 10 minutes of hard physical work rather than words. They learned that Clara cried sometimes at night when she thought he was asleep, quiet and private, and that on those nights he would lay a hand on her back without speaking, which was what she needed and which he understood without being told. They visited Samuel's grave together on the first Sunday of every month, which was a practice Clara had kept alone, and which she allowed Hugh to join because he asked respectfully, and because she understood that sharing grief is not the same as diminishing it. Samuel's grave was under the oak at the back of the property. The stone was small and modest, and James had carved it himself, which was evident from the slightly uneven letters of their son's name. Hugh stood with her and was quiet. In spring, he repaired the small fence around the plot that winter had knocked askew, doing it with the same care he brought to every fence on the property, small posts set plumb and wire tensed correctly, because it deserved the same care as everything else. "Thank you," Clara said when she saw it. "He was here," Hugh said simply. "He's still here. The place should show it." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she took his hand and they walked back to the house together through the April grass. Spring of 1880 brought the expansion they had planned. Hugh rode south to a ranch near Wellington and bought 15 additional cattle with the profit from the fall sales and Clara's careful winter budgeting, selecting them with the methodical eye of a man who has been working cattle long enough to know which ones will thrive and which will give you grief. He brought them back in a 3-day drive that left him tired and satisfied, and Clara met him at the gate with coffee that had been kept hot on the back of the stove. "How are they?" she asked, watching the new cattle move through the gate into the holding pasture. "4 of the cows will calve by summer. The steers are in good condition. There's one old girl in the back there who I suspect is smarter than either of us, which will be entertaining to discover." Clara watched the cattle settle into the pasture. Her expression was one of genuine satisfaction, the look of someone watching a plan take shape. "James always wanted to get to 100 head," she said. "We're close. By fall with the calves we'll be past it," Hugh said. She turned and looked at him, and the morning sun was full on her face, and she was glowing with it, with the spring and the cattle and the plan coming together. And he thought, as he often thought when he looked at her these days, that he had arrived on this porch a year ago with 43 cents and a lame horse, and had been given, without entirely understanding what he was asking for, the best thing he would ever have. Roland's came once more that summer, and this time it was different. He arrived in July to find Hugh in the yard mending a bridle and Clara coming out the front door, and the dynamic of the property had plainly shifted in ways that told him without words that his previous arguments no longer applied. Clara introduced Hugh as her husband with the simple factual calm of a woman who has absolutely no interest in how this information lands on its recipient. Rollins took it with visible effort. He congratulated them briefly and with a formality that was not quite convincing, and then said that he supposed his offer was off the table. "It was off the table a long time before today," Clara said pleasantly. "Would you like coffee? We were about to put a pot on." He declined and rode away, and Hugh watched him go with a calm that contained some residual wariness, because men like Rollins do not always accept the end of things gracefully. But Rollins did not come back. There was a recession in land prices later that year that redirected his attention elsewhere, and by the following year, he had moved his operation to a different county entirely, which resolved that particular concern permanently. Hugh's mother, who was still living in Missouri and who had not met Clara yet, sent a letter in the summer of 1880 that was short and warm, and expressed the kind of restrained maternal relief that comes from watching a son drift without anchor for years, and then hearing that he has finally come to rest somewhere. She sent a small package with the letter, wrapped in brown paper which contained a quilt she had made herself, blue and cream in a log cabin pattern which Clara received with genuine delight and immediately put on their bed. "I want to meet her," Clara told Hugh that evening. "She'll love you," he said. "You don't know that. She will. You're the first thing I've done in 31 years that would meet with her unqualified approval." Clara smiled at him over the top of the letter, which she had read twice. "Then I am very pleased to take that responsibility." The fall roundup of 1880 was the best the Turner ranch had seen in years. They drove 22 head to the Caldwell stockyards, and McCready paid well, and they rode home with money in the saddlebag and plans in their heads and the particular contentment that comes from a hard year well finished. Clara went over the numbers that evening and reported that they could take out a small loan in the spring to build the second barn they had been discussing, which would allow them to properly shelter twice as many horses and expand that side of the operation. "We could sell horses as a second income," she said, tapping her pencil against the ledger. "There's constant demand from new settlers. A good riding horse or a solid work team is always worth money." "We'd need a proper stallion," Hugh said. "A good one, not just serviceable. I know a man in Pratt County," she said. "He breeds quarter horses. I've seen his animals. They're excellent." He looked at her over the kitchen table, this woman who had books of numbers in her head and plans stacked 3 deep, and who could calve a difficult cow in the middle of the night and then come in and make coffee without needing to comment on either the difficulty or the accomplishment. He reached across the table and took her hand. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "You just keep being excellent and I keep noticing it." She gave him a look that was affectionate and exasperated in equal parts, which he had learned was her face for "I love you" when she was also slightly embarrassed by it. Their son was born in March of 1881, a loud and emphatic boy who arrived with considerable urgency on a cold Thursday morning, when the doctor from town made it just in time, coming through the bedroom door still pulling his coat off. Hugh spent the labor in the kitchen because the doctor's wife, who was also his nurse and midwife, had told him plainly that the kitchen was where he was needed, and the bedroom was not his domain until further notice. And so he stayed in the kitchen and made coffee, and then forgot the coffee, and walked a circuit of the kitchen floor approximately 400 times until the thin, furious wail from the next room told him that something important had changed. The doctor's wife opened the bedroom door and said, "A fine boy. Come see." Clara was propped against the pillows, pale and quiet and triumphant, with the baby in her arms. The baby was red-faced and had dark hair and was very emphatically himself in a way that brand-new humans are before the world has had a chance to smooth out their edges. Hugh sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with an emotion that was too large and too complicated to name, but that included, in layers he could feel separately, awe and gratitude and love, and a particular sobering weight of responsibility that was not frightening exactly, but was serious in the way that the most important things always are. "He looks angry," Hugh said. "He's not angry," Clara said. "He's been through an ordeal. He's expressing himself." "He looks like you," Hugh said. "He looks like himself," Clara said, and she looked down at the baby with an expression that Hugh recognized immediately because he had seen it before in the barn in the moment after a difficult calf was born and the cow turned to smell it. It was a recognition so complete that it required no further processing. They named him James, for Clara's first husband, because Clara wanted that and because Hugh understood without reservation or difficulty that James Turner deserved to be remembered on this land by more than a grave marker and a fence built from timber he had ordered. The name was a gift Clara gave to both James and to her son, and Hugh gave it with her. James Atkins, called Jamie from the first week because he was emphatically a Jamie rather than a James, was the kind of baby who made an immediate and permanent impression on every surface of life. He was healthy and vigorous, and had his mother's direct brown eyes and her firmness of opinion, which expressed itself before he was 6 months old in a very clear preference for certain foods and persons, and a very clear objection to others. Hugh was a preferred person, which he appreciated with a depth he hadn't anticipated. There is nothing quite like being specifically chosen by a small person who has not yet learned to be diplomatic about their preferences. The horse breeding plan came together in the spring of 1882, when they bought a 3-year-old quarter horse stallion from the man in Pratt County, a leggy dark bay with good bone, and a sensible temperament that Clara declared was exactly what she had wanted. They named him Charter, and he arrived at the Turner Ranch in April with considerable ceremony, and immediately established himself as the most opinionated resident of the property, which was saying something given the current household. The first foals came in spring of 1883, 4 of them, and 3 were fillies and 1 was a colt, and the colt had Charter's bone, and his dam's endurance, and a marking on his forehead like a crescent moon, and Clara said they should sell him at 2 years old because he would command a premium and they needed the capital, and Hugh agreed with her because she was right, and they sold him for more than either of them had projected and put the money toward the North Pasture expansion. Hugh's mother, Martha Atkins, came from Missouri for the summer of 1882. She was a small, sharp-eyed woman in her late 50s, who had raised 3 children largely alone after Hugh's father died when Hugh was 12, and who had therefore developed a thorough and practical understanding of what hard work and character looked like. She arrived on the stage from Wichita, and Clara met her at the stage stop with Jamie on her hip, and the 2 women looked at each other for a moment, and then Martha said, "You're exactly as I imagined you," in a tone that was clearly a compliment, and Clara said, "I'm very glad to meet you, and Jamie has been asking about you since he learned the word grandmother, which came out as gamma for the first 2 weeks but is now quite clear." And Martha reached for the baby with the practiced ease of a grandmother who has been waiting for exactly this experience. Hugh, standing behind Clara with the horses, watched his mother hold his son and felt something complete itself that he had not quite known was incomplete. Martha stayed 6 weeks, and they were good weeks. She and Clara cooked together and talked in the kitchen in the evenings after Hugh had turned in, and he could hear them from the bedroom, 2 women's voices in conversation, sometimes quiet and sometimes laughing, and it was one of the better sounds his life had offered him. Garrett Rowland's Land Company, which had been operating in an adjacent county, collapsed in the economic difficulties of 1883 when a combination of bad investments and a hard winter wiped out several of the spreads he had absorbed and couldn't maintain. The news came through Caldwell's grapevine, and Hugh heard it at the store and brought it home to Clara, who received it without satisfaction or gloating, because she was not that kind of person. "I don't take pleasure in a man's failure," she said. "But I won't pretend it doesn't make our choice look correct in hindsight." "It always looked correct," Hugh said. "Yes," she agreed, "but it helps to have evidence." By 1884, the Turner Ranch, which everyone still called the Turner Ranch because that was its name, and its history, even though it was now jointly operated by Hugh and Clara Atkins, had grown to 120 head of cattle and 12 horses in the breeding program, with 4 ranch horses besides, and a property that was well-maintained and solvent and building towards something that would outlast both of them. They had hired a permanent hand, a quiet young man named Thomas who was 17 when he arrived and 19 now, serious and competent and grateful for the work in the way that Hugh himself had been grateful 5 years ago. Clara treated Thomas the same way she had treated Hugh that first day, with fairness and clear expectations and the dignity of being taken seriously. She paid him properly and fed him well, and did not treat the bunkhouse as less than it was, which was a person's home. Hugh had conversations with Thomas in the evenings, sometimes that he recognized as the conversations a man has when he's trying to pass on what he's learned without making it sound like a lecture. The way that good cowboys talk to younger ones when the fire's going down, and there's nothing left to do but talk. Jamie turned 3 and 4 and 5, and was a constant source of animation on the property. He had his mother's stubbornness and his father's steadiness in a combination that produced a child who knew what he wanted and would wait patiently for it for as long as necessary. He followed Hugh everywhere, and this produced in Hugh a tenderness that sometimes surprised him with its force. The way love that grows gradually is sometimes more startling than love that comes fast. "He's like your shadow," Thomas observed one afternoon, watching Jamie trail after Hugh across the yard. "He's better than my shadow," Hugh said. "My shadow never asks interesting questions." Clara, who was nearby, smiled without looking up from what she was doing. Their daughter was born in the autumn of 1884, a September child, arrived in the world with considerably more composure than her brother had managed, and looked around the room with a thoughtful expression that made the doctor laugh. They named her Eleanor, for Clara's mother, and Ellie from the second day, because she was already emphatically an Ellie. Eleanor came from Fredericksburg for the birth and stayed through the winter, which Clara said was an unexpected blessing, and which was entirely true because 2 small children and a working ranch in a Kansas winter requires all available hands. Eleanor was in magnificent form, taking Ellie in the nights sometimes so Clara could sleep, and telling Jamie stories in the evenings that kept him quietly absorbed for long periods, and Hugh developed a deep and uncomplicated affection for his mother-in-law that he expressed by making sure her coffee was always fresh and her chair was always near the fire. "You are a good man, Hugh Atkins," Eleanor told him one evening, with the directness that Clara had clearly inherited from her. "You are exactly the right kind of man for my daughter, and I want you to know that I see it." He was not accustomed to being evaluated so plainly and found it briefly disorienting. "Thank you, Eleanor," he said. "James was that kind of man too," she continued. "Clara has been twice fortunate. Not all people are once fortunate. She has been twice." She paused. "You have been once, but I believe you know what that is worth." "Every day," he said, and he meant it without reservation. The spring of 1885 brought a new development that Hugh had been thinking about for 2 years. He approached Clara one evening after supper when the children were asleep and Thomas had gone to the bunkhouse, and he sat across from her at the kitchen table where she had her ledger open. "I want to talk to you about something," he said. She looked up. She could read his tone with precision now. "What is it?" "I want to formally record the property in both our names," he said. "It's been on my mind. When we married it remained in your name, which was right and proper because it was yours. But I've been thinking about what happens if something happens to me or to you, and I want the legal record to show clearly that this is both of ours and both our children's." Clara looked at him for a moment. "I've been thinking the same thing," she said quietly. "I didn't raise it because I wasn't sure how you'd feel about it. Some men have complicated feelings about property." "Not about this property," he said. "This is our land." She smiled at him slowly, that full smile that had not become any less affecting over 6 years. "Let's go to the land office in Caldwell next week." "Next week," he agreed. The deed was recorded in June of 1885, in the names of Hugh Atkins and Clara Atkins, and they rode home from the land office in a summer afternoon light that made the prairie gold and long-shadowed, and somewhere between Caldwell and the ranch, Clara reached over from her horse and took his hand, briefly, the way she had that first time on the porch in the September dark, and he felt the fullness of everything that had accumulated since then. All the mornings and the work and the grief, and the cattle, and the children and the coffee and the evenings, all of it weight and blessing in equal measure. Thomas left in the spring of 1886 for his own opportunity, a position with a larger cattle operation near Dodge City that would pay him better than the Turner Ranch could match. Hugh and Clara gave him a proper send-off, with a meal and a small sum of money over his last wages that Clara had been putting aside for the purpose since she'd known it was coming. "This is the work," Hugh told him, the morning Thomas rode out. "You find the land and the people that are worth the work, and you do it right. That's the whole thing." Thomas shook his hand and nodded with the seriousness of a young man who is trying to hold on to advice he knows he'll need later. "I learned it here," he said. "I'm grateful." They watched him ride away down the same road Hugh had come up 6 years earlier, and Hugh stood in the yard and thought about the way good things move through time and carry forward. They hired 2 hands the following spring, brothers named Eli and Cord Marsh, who were in their mid-20s and came from a Missouri family that knew cattle and horses and hard work. They were easy to work with and competent, and the ranch's expanded operation made 2 hands not a luxury but a practical necessity. Clara managed the household and the accounts and worked alongside everyone on the days when the work required all available bodies, which was often, because the ranch was now a substantial operation by the standards of the county. Jamie, at 8 years old, was becoming a capable presence in his own right, following the ranch's rhythms with a seriousness that occasionally made even Eli and Cord exchange impressed glances. He could handle most of the horses with confidence, understood the basics of cattle management at a level beyond his years, and had his mother's head for numbers, which he demonstrated by correctly calculating the hay budget when he'd been listening to his parents discuss it at the table and offered his answer before either of them reached it. "He's going to be formidable," Hugh told Clara that evening. "He already is," she said. "We should probably be careful what we discuss at the table." Ellie at 4 was her own person entirely, quieter than her brother but with a careful intensity of observation that reminded Hugh of Clara at her most focused. She had found a particular affinity for the horses and could spend an entire morning on the paddock fence watching Charter move in the pasture, content in a way that spoke of genuine absorption rather than childish distraction. "She has a feeling for them," Hugh told Clara. "The way some people have a feeling for music." "She does," Clara agreed. "We should develop it. She should learn properly." And so Ellie's education in horsemanship began before she could quite reach the stirrups without help, on a small steady mare named Biscuit who had come from the breeding stock and had a temperament of exceptional patience. And Hugh taught her the same way he had learned, from the ground up, starting with the relationship, with trust, with the understanding that a horse is a fellow creature with its own intelligence and not merely an instrument. The summer of 1887 was the best the Turner Ranch had known. The cattle were 130 head. The breeding program had produced 6 foals that spring, 3 of which had already been sold at excellent prices. The ranch was profitable enough to repair the house properly, which had needed new board siding on the east face and a rebuilt chimney since the previous winter, and to expand the vegetable garden that Clara had been cultivating since the first year, which now fed the entire household through the summer and provided preserved food for winter. Clara planted flowers along the front porch in the late summer of 1887, something she had not done before, and Hugh asked her about it one evening when she was working in the new flower bed and he was sitting on the porch steps watching her. "James always wanted me to," she said, not looking up from her planting. "I told him there was no time for flowers when there was real work to do. He said flowers were real work, just a different kind." She sat back on her heels and looked at the seedlings. "I've been thinking about that lately. I think he was right." Hugh considered this. "He seems to have been right about a lot of things." "He was," Clara said. And then she looked at Hugh directly, and there was something in her face that was open in the way that complete trust makes a person open. "I am grateful every day for the life he built and helped me build. And I am grateful for you who came and kept building it and made it something new." She paused. "I don't think about those 2 things as separate anymore. They're the same story." He got up from the step and crouched beside her in the flower bed, not caring about his good trousers, and he looked at her with everything he felt showing plainly on his face because, with her, it had never been his instinct to hide anything. "It's our story," he said. She leaned forward and kissed him, there in the flower bed with the summer evening warm around them, and the children's voices audible somewhere around the back of the house, and the horses moving in the near pasture and Charter calling to something across the fence. And the kiss was unhurried and certain, and held 6 years of mornings and work and grief and love, and the accumulated specific weight of a life built together. "It is," she agreed, against his mouth. The flower bed flourished. By the following summer it had spread along the entire porch front, reds and yellows and deep blues, and Clara kept it as James had wanted her to. And sometimes on Sunday mornings when the week's work had laid out properly, and there was a rare hour of genuine idleness, she and Hugh sat on the porch with their coffee and the children at their feet and the flowers all around them and looked out at the land that was theirs, properly and completely and in the way that matters most. Which is the way you earn a thing with your hands and your time and your heart. Eleanor, Clara's mother, passed in the winter of 1888. She had been unwell since the previous autumn, and Clara had known it was coming in the way that people know things they are trying not to know. And when the letter came from her brother in Fredericksburg in February, she read it at the kitchen table, and Hugh sat with her while she cried, fully this time. Not the quiet private grief of the nights, but open and full. And he held her and said nothing because there are no words that are better than presence in those moments. He made the trip with her to Fredericksburg for the funeral, leaving the children with Eli and Cord's wife, who lived in town and had been enlisted for exactly this kind of necessity. They were away for 2 weeks, and in those 2 weeks Hugh met Clara's brother and sister-in-law and her remaining family, and they met him, and there was, on all sides, the careful measuring that families do when they are deciding whether to trust someone with their person. At the end of the 2 weeks, Clara's brother, a quiet man named Frank who looked like their mother and shared her direct manner, shook Hugh's hand at the stage and said, "She's happy. You can see it. Thank you for that." Hugh shook his hand back. "Thank you for trusting me with her." On the stage back to Wichita, Clara leaned against Hugh's shoulder and slept for part of the journey, which was not something she often did because she was not generally inclined toward helplessness, even in the acceptable form of sleeping on a shoulder. He held very still so she could sleep and watched the Texas landscape give way to Oklahoma territory, and then to Kansas, and thought about all the miles between this moment and the morning he had ridden into Caldwell with 43 cents and a lame horse, and the arithmetic of it was staggering in the best possible way. They were home in early March of 1889, which was a significant year in the broader history of the territory, because April of 1889 was the land run that opened Oklahoma territory to settlement, and the entire region was electric with it, with people moving through Caldwell by the hundreds on their way south, the old cattle-driving town finding new life as a staging ground for this enormous human movement toward land. Hugh and Clara watched it from their own settled ground with a complex feeling, the understanding that what looked like opportunity for the newcomers carried with it costs for the people who had already been living there. Costs that were not spoken in the newspapers or the official celebrations, but that Hugh had heard enough about from men who had ridden through the territory to understand were real and heavy. "People talk about it like it's empty land being given away," Clara said one evening, watching the dust of another wagon train heading south. "It's not empty." "No," Hugh said. "It never was." They said no more about it because there was no comfortable position to be found in it, only the honest recognition of an injustice they had no power to correct, and the resolution to name it honestly rather than look away from it, which was the least a person could do. The summer of 1889 was a growing one in every sense. Jamie, at 9, began taking on genuine ranch responsibilities, not play work but actual contribution, and handled himself with a competence that made Eli and Cord treat him as a junior colleague rather than a child, which Jamie received with a seriousness that made his parents exchange private smiles over his head. Ellie, at 5, was riding Biscuit independently and asking questions about Charter's breeding program that were beyond her years and entirely on point. Clara had a surprise announcement in August of 1889, delivered across the supper table with the calm, matter-of-fact efficiency she brought to all important information. "We're going to have another child," she said. "Spring, I think." Hugh set down his fork and looked at her. She was looking back at him with that expression that mixed the practical and the tender in proportions only she could manage. "Are you well?" he asked. "Very," she said. "Entirely. I'm not made of glass, Hugh." "I know you're not," he said. "I've never thought you were." "Good," she said, and returned to her supper with the air of a woman who has delivered the relevant information and is ready to move forward to the next item. Jamie looked between his parents with the alert curiosity of a child who understands more than adults give him credit for. "Is it going to be a boy or a girl?" he asked. "We don't know yet," Clara said. "I want a brother," Jamie said. "You'll take what comes and be grateful," Clara told him, which was the most Clara sentence he had ever constructed in his 9 years of existence, and he nodded as if this were entirely reasonable, which it was. The winter of 1889 through 1890 was a time of particular quiet richness on the Turner ranch. Clara's pregnancy progressed well, and she continued working at her usual pace, which the doctor from Caldwell noted with mild exasperation on his quarterly visits, and which Clara noted with mild amusement in return, because she had done this twice already and understood her own body's capacity. Hugh took on more of the physical outdoor work without making it a point of discussion, simply being where the heavy lifting was, and Clara accepted this redistribution of labor with the pragmatic ease of someone who understands the difference between help and condescension. They read together in the evenings, which had become a habit over the years, taking turns with whatever books came through Caldwell's small lending library or were ordered from the catalog. They were working through a history of the cattle trade that winter, which produced regular commentary from both of them, particularly from Clara on the sections that attributed the success of the cattle industry almost entirely to the male drovers and operators, without mentioning the wives and daughters and widows who had kept the operations running through illness and absence and death. "History has a selective memory," she observed, setting the book down. "It does," Hugh agreed. "You should write one," she looked at him. "A history, an account of this place, what James built and what you built on top of it, what we've built." He meant it entirely. "There should be a record of it." She was quiet for a moment, turning this over. "That's not a small undertaking." "No, but you've built a ranch from the edge of collapse. I don't think a written account would defeat you." The look she gave him then was one of the ones he loved best, complicated and warm and slightly defiant, as though she was annoyed at being accurately encouraged. "I'll think about it," she said. She did more than think about it. She started keeping a more detailed ranch journal that winter, recording not just the practical accounts but the story of the place, and it grew over the following years into something that was genuinely a history, complete and honest and written in the clear, direct prose of a woman who never used 2 words where one would serve. Their second son was born in April of 1890, a strong and furious boy who announced himself with considerable volume, and did not stop announcing himself for the first 6 weeks of his life in a way that was exhausting and deeply charming in equal measure. They named him Robert, for Hugh's father, which made Martha, who was visiting again, cry quiet, pleased tears into her coffee. Jamie, true to form, was delighted with a brother, and immediately appointed himself as Robert's primary educator in all matters pertaining to horses, cattle, and the proper running of a ranch, a role he began practicing while Robert was still primarily interested in sleeping and eating, and had opinions limited to immediate comfort. Ellie, at 6, was more contemplative about the new arrival. She studied Robert with the same careful attention she gave to the horses, and concluded after about 2 weeks that he was acceptable and interesting, and began including him in her observations of the world with a thoroughness that Robert would later grow into. The Turner Ranch in 1890 was a different place from the struggling property Hugh had ridden up to in the spring of 1879. The fence lines were tight and well maintained on every boundary. The barn was full. The horses were excellent. The cattle were 130 head of healthy, well-managed stock. The house was solid and warm and full, 2 stories of stone and timber built by a careful man and maintained carefully by the people who loved it. The porch had flowers. The kitchen always smelled of coffee or food or both. The small cemetery under the oak tree was tended and respected, with James Turner's name on his marker and Samuel's name on the small stone below it. Hugh stood at the gate of that cemetery one morning in October of 1890, the fall air sharp and the oak tree blazing orange above him, and he felt the weight and the rightness of everything this land held. Samuel, who would have been 11 years old if fever had not taken him. James, who had built this place with such care and chosen Clara to build it with, and who had been the kind of man his fence posts told you he was, honest and solid and looking toward the future, both of them present in the land and in the people who lived on it. Clara came up behind him and slipped her hand into his without speaking. They stood together for a moment in the October quiet. He would have been 10 in November, Clara said, meaning Samuel. I still think about it. Not with the same pain as before, but I still think about it. I know, Hugh said. You never knew him, she said, but you've honored him, that matters. He squeezed her hand. He's part of this land. That makes him part of us. She leaned her head against his shoulder briefly, the way she did sometimes, an unspoken rest. They walked back to the house together, past the flower beds that were going brown now for the winter but would come back next spring with full color, past the barn where Charter was turned out for the morning and was moving with his characteristic authority across the paddock, past the woodpile Hugh had spent 3 days in September laying up for winter, past everything that was theirs in the deepest sense of that word. Robert was in Alina's arms on the porch, because Ellie had appointed herself as Ellie and was doing the chore of scattering feed for the chickens with the methodical precision she brought to all assigned tasks. Jamie was in the barn with Eli, doing something that involved considerable sound and what was probably entirely sanctioned work. Clara went up the porch steps and took Robert from Ellie and settled into her chair with him on her lap. Hugh sat in his chair beside her. The morning was golden and cold and still. Ellie finished with the chickens and came and sat on the step at her father's feet, leaning against his leg in the comfortable way of a small person who has absolute certainty of welcome. "Good morning," Hugh said to her. "Good morning, Papa," Ellie said, and looked out across the yard with her usual thoughtful expression. He put a hand on her hair and looked out across the yard with her, at the land that had given him everything he had and asked only his best work in return, at the woman he loved sitting beside him in the October sun with their baby in her arms and their children around them, and their life spread out in every direction as wide and solid and real as the Kansas sky above it. He thought, as he did sometimes, about the morning he had ridden into Caldwell with 43 cents and nowhere urgent to be. He thought about the storekeeper with the ink-stained fingers who had mentioned a widow woman out on the Kisham side. He thought about the porch and Clara's straight back and her rifle within easy reach and her eyes that were direct and unafraid. He had asked for 1 season of work. She had said yes. He had never named his price, because the truth was that from some early, instinctive place, he had understood that money was not what he was looking for, that he was looking for exactly this: ground under his feet that was worth standing on, work that meant something, people who were worth the love you gave them. He had found it all at the Turner Ranch, this woman who had built her life twice over and opened a door to let him help her go on building it, and he had given it everything he had in return, which was all the work in his hands and all the steadiness in his character and all the love that had quietly, irrevocably, grown in the space of 6 months and 12 years and every morning in between. The morning held. The meadowlark called from the east pasture. Robert made a small sound of approval about something. Clara reached over without looking and put her hand on Hugh's arm, and he covered it with his own. The land was theirs and they were its, and it was enough. It was entirely, completely, permanently enough.